Cuba has a very large history, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now in Cuba, so let's talk about it very, very quickly. And you better remember this stuff too, because I'm going to ask you about it later. So we start in the colonial period of 1492. Columbus sails the ocean blue and lands on Cuba during his first voyage to the Americas. Spanish colonization then starts in 1511, and in 1526, some of the very first slaves from Africa are brought into Cuba to work in tobacco and sugar plantations. Then we enter Spanish colonial rule, and in 1762, Havana is captured by British forces during the 7 Years' War, but it gets returned to Spain as Spain trades it for Florida in 1763. In 1868 through 1878, the 10 Years' War occurs. The first impactful Cuban struggle for independence from Spain, led by Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, ends without the goal of independence achieved. And in 1895 through 1898, Cuban War of Independence, led by Jose Marti and others, begins. Independence and American involvement is what begins to happen in 1898 through 1933, and in 1898, the Spanish-American War leads to Spain stopping its control of Cuba. The United States occupies it. In 1902, Cuba then receives formal independence, although the Platt Amendment lets the U.S. intervene in Cuban affairs. And in 1933, a revolution that is led by Fulgencio Batista topples the government. In 1940 through 1952, Batista is elected president in 1940. This begins with the Batista era. He decides to implement social reforms. And in 1952, Batista seizes power in a military coup, and he establishes a dictatorship. In 1953 through 1959 is the Cuban Revolution. In 1953, an attack in the Moncada barracks, led by Fidel Castro, is unsuccessful. In 1958, Castro, Che Guevara, and others land in Cuba to start a guerrilla war. In 1959, Batista flees Cuba. Castro's forces take reign, and they mark their victory. 1961 through 1965 starts the communist era, and in 1961, U.S. breaks diplomatic relations with Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failed attempt by Cuban exiles backed by U.S. to overthrow Castro, also takes place during this year. 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis begins and brings world to the brink of nuclear war. And in 1965, the Communist Party of Cuba is established. In the 1980s, and the Cuban drug crisis begins. The Cuban drug crisis involves government officials and drug trafficking. High-powered Cuban officials such as General Arnaldo Ochoa and several others were significantly involved in smuggling cocaine for the Medellin cartel. This led to significant trials and executions in 1989, damaging the reputation of Cuba and showing the island's involvement in international drug trade. Of 1991 through 2008, in 1991, the collapse of the Soviets leads to an economic crisis in Cuba. This is referred to as the Special Period. And in 1998, Pope John Paul II visits Cuba, leading to a thaw in a church-state relationship. 2006, because of the health issues, Fidel Castro temporarily leaves his power to his brother, Raul, and in 2008, Raul Castro becomes president. Now we're leading up to the current events for 2014 through 2021. 2014 marks the time that Cuba and the U.S. announced the restoration of diplomatic relations. And in 2016, Fidel Castro dies at 90 years old. 2018 marks the time when Miguel Diaz-Canel takes Raul's position. And in 2021, Raul steps down as the leader of the Communist Party. In 2024, this year now, Cuba is in the midst of a revival in religious diversity as well as broader social changes. Although previously atheists, more people are allowed to be outspoken about their religious identity. This is leading to the country optimizing more freedoms as a whole. Modern-day Cuba is now a democracy more than ever, and it's only going to take a few more time for it to get in the right direction and drop that communistic party that has been holding them tight for so long. They've been gaining more religious freedoms and more social freedoms. And their economy, although starting to drop a bit due to sugar, their biggest industry, losing its financial control and stability, they will still be able to find great ways to keep the economy intact as long as they find ways to give themselves more social freedoms.